Welcome back to Walking Away from Arcadia. This is Simon Eichhornchen, and my co host Victor is here as well. And a couple of weeks ago, you would have heard our in canon history episode. And since it was very unlike the other episodes we've done so far, we both thought it would be useful to have a little bit of a discussion about why we included the stories we included in that episode.
So, a little bit of background on that episode where the idea came from. It was Simon's idea originally. He pitched it to me, and it was originally going to be like half and half fiction, discussion, maybe two-thirds fiction, a third discussion. And then it grew and it grew. And it started out much smaller in scope than what we finally posted, but we just really liked everything we put together so much that we decided to sort of split out the discussion and conversation of the canon into a separate episode. So I guess we're going to start kind of at the top and go through the sections that we wrote and we performed with ourselves and some other people we know and talk about their place in the canon. I guess the first piece isn't really a piece. It's the framing that Simon came up with to sort of explain the walkthrough and tie everything together. And there's a little bit of Simon headcanon here, and I've sort of adopted this headcanon as well. Would you like to talk about your crazy tinfoil hat theory about House Dannon?
Sure. I have a pretty strong antipathy for the end times books that came out for World of Darkness during their original run, and House Dannon was originally introduced in one of those, and I haven't read it. But they came back in C20 and got some words there, and I really enjoyed their reverse mists problem, where they forget things about the mundane world, but they have a pretty good memory for things that other changelings shouldn't. They always struck me as kind of more alien than the other she are kind of thing. I kept thinking to myself, like, why would that be? Why would they have this reverse mist thing? What's going on here? In my head canon, it kind of folded together with one of my big questions, like, why does the mists do what it does? Does it actually have limits? What are those limits? In my head canon, the mists is sort of the force that goes around and mucks around with people's heads, whether that's actually some kind of external force or it's humans or other supernaturals mundane psyches getting in there and being like, nope, I've got defensive mechanisms. I don't want that thing. Changelings also have human minds, so they would be able to do that too. But what about physical evidence? Once I read about House Dannon, I was like, oh, it actually makes sense for them to be like the men in black who pop into the real world and make off with physical evidence or confuse the physical evidence in order to do the things the mists can't do.
I really like that theory, and I like that in large part because of something I've seen a couple C20 writers who engage in public areas mention, and that is talking about how powerful the She were during the Concordance War, and how now, they have standard character creation processes, and sure, they get a little bit of a sovereign advantage by nature of rank, but that's about it. Why did the Concordance War go the way it did? And the answer was, well, after the resurgence, there was this period where they came back and there was this rush of glamour and there was this rush of remembrance, and they came back with all of this knowledge from the dreaming and from Arcadia and all of this magical capability, and they rode that wave. It was almost like a society scale chrysalis that only they benefited from. And they rode the wave of that through the Concordance War. And they don't have that anymore. I mean, there are glimmers here and there that might cause little tiny localized versions of that, but you don't have it on the huge scale. The way the myths work for House Dannon, they would have all of that knowledge. I mean, if some player wants to take on the monumental role-playing task of playing a member of House Dannon, you should use the fixed rules because, game balance. But if you're using them as a plot point, if you're using them as a storyteller, they should always have the kind of power that the She had during the Resurgence because they wouldn't have forgotten any of that stuff. They just can't keep track of what the hell is going on around them. So that makes sense that they would come in and they would have the kind of magics necessary to just warp Fey history texts the way, it's described in C20, that could be them doing that. And I think it's a really fascinating way to use that house in a unique way.
If they're going to sort of fill that role and pop into the real world long enough to confuse things in order to, protect the changelings, more or less. But if they're going to pop into the real world to do that and confuse things to protect the Fae, they need to be able to be minimally functional in the real world because of their reverse Mists dynamic. They need, in my mind anyway, they would need to have little outposts throughout the dreaming with ways to help them remember aspects of the real world, their mission, and how to navigate the more near Earth parts of the dreaming, which is where the framing device came from for that episode.
Yeah, and I had a lot of fun with that framing device. I thought it was pretty brilliant. It's only fair to give a little bit of nod to some of the aesthetic inspiration for that. If any of our listeners haven't listened to it, you should absolutely listen to Within the Wires. You'll see some parallels there.
Yes, Within the Wires is wonderful and does a much better job with that framing device than I did.
You did an awfully good job with it. I enjoyed it thoroughly, and I hope other people did as well. Then I guess we should absolutely dive into the actual bits and pieces of the fiction. The first piece, Exhibit 2, because Exhibit 1 was really just about the framing device itself, taking the rock. I'm not going to talk too much about the history of the Nunyahi and Alcatraz because at this point you've heard me talk about it in 2 other episodes. The very quick, brief run over of it for anyone who is maybe diving in here and hasn't listened to the Glamour Banality episode and the Nunyahi episode is at the same time that the first battle of the Concordance War was happening in San Francisco. There was a large-scale Native American occupation of Alcatraz. It was a really big cultural event. In doing a history of all of Changeling, we wanted to include the Nunyahi. And I wanted to tell a story that was just about the Nunyahi, but still represented a significant moment in the canon, which is a little difficult to do. Most of the time when they're talked about in the canon in the Changeling books, it's kind of about, well, what role did they play in the Concordance War? What is their opinion of the Cathane? And I wanted to avoid that. And so I did some research and I talked with an indigenous gamer friend of mine who helped with that piece, Laura Martinez. And she helped me brainstorm, and then she helped collaborate a little bit on the reviewing the writing itself. She recommended Alcatraz. I had sort of done research and I had like 3 or 4 possibilities picked out, and she sort of said, no, Alcatraz, that makes a lot of sense when I told her some more about the canon history. It's a really interesting counterpoint if you think about what was going on in the dreaming in that moment when the war started in San Francisco, and then what was going on just across the bay. I also did something else with it in that I brought in a gloam. And I thought it's Alcatraz, so let's have a gloam. Let's have a gloam of the rock, because it was just too delicious not to do that. And I kind of wanted to call out the fact that in the anime write-ups, their relationship to the Cathane, to crafting, to human endeavor is always framed through a very Western lens. And the first time I played in an anime, it was in a game. It was one of Simon's games with a lot of Nunyahi characters. And, I thought about the fact that none of that sort of tension between crafting and not being crafted makes as much sense if you're not talking about sort of modern European divisions and what settler colonial Europeans have done to the land and to things and transforming them and just sort of taking the whole strip mining dynamic. And so I wanted to acknowledge that tension. And so that's why I built in that bit about other in anime not recognizing the Nunyehi, because that's a major point where the in anime are presented and showing up in America, but primarily having a relationship with the Cathane, which is weird. In America, you would expect them before the shattering to have had a relationship primarily with the Nunyehi. So I wanted to sort of illuminate those dynamics in the canon history.
Then we had Exhibit 3, which was a voicemail. As somebody whose parents screened calls pretty extensively, we had a lot of accidentally recorded conversations in our house. I thought it was important for us to have a vignette that was just between the she after the accordance piece, because so much of the game is really about this kind of false peace. The she consider it a peace because they are prospering, but what about everybody else? And I think a lot of games focus on that what about everybody else thing, but part of being able to see what is good for a specific group of people, but also really, truly, insidiously kind of horrific and maybe even a little bit banal, is seeing how the victors in the war behave when no one else is around. And I'm really glad that Victor wrote this because I don't think it's a thing I could have written.
Yeah, this is one of the pieces that Simon came up with the original idea for. The Nunyehi piece was kind of all me. Simon wrote the pitch for this. He wrote sort of the perspective of the characters, and I took it and ran with it. I wanted to capture that the she kind of know what they did. They know what they're doing, but of course they're entitled to it. And that's why I wanted to create this juxtaposition between the Parliament of Dreams is crumbs thrown to the peasants, and they know that. But when the same thing is applied to the unseelie she, it's a moment of offense. And I wanted that cognitive dissonance of like, that is just a completely natural thing for them to transition between, and they are totally oblivious to the hypocrisy inherent in engaging in both of those things. I thought the best way to do that, and not, I also didn't want it to turn into an all unseelie, hate fest, because then you're getting away from the broader power dynamics. And I know when I've looked at fan reactions to the she, one of the favorite houses just across the board is Islaned. Making it the story about Islaned and Aileal seemed like a really good way to cross that Seelie unseelie boundary and capture all that hypocrisy and intrigue. And so that's what I was really trying to capture. I also loved getting the kind of seasonal references in there. It was, I think, the first piece I wrote, and I had a lot of fun with it.
Yeah, it was one of those ones where I read what you wrote and I was like, yeah, I don't get this, but I didn't expect to get it. And then having worked on it in recording, hearing human voices say the lines, everything kind of fell into place for me.
I remember you saying that after we finished recording. It felt weird to write it. Like I had fun with it, but it was so alien to write that, but I have absolutely met people that talk and think in that mold. I don't tend to stay around them very long, but I have been exposed to it. So yeah, I was able to kind of channel that. I didn't want it to become mustache twirlingly sappy, although they are awfully full of themselves. The next piece is an interesting exchange. This one was all Simon, although I did read Sigurd. The framing starts out with the idea of a Walkman player and headphones. I really liked the framing here because, unlike some of the others that evoke what you hear, recordings, this felt very tactile to me. And it's a very tactile exchange. and it's Sigurd and a brownie. I think of him very specifically as a brownie and not a boggin, and I'll let Simon explain that in more detail. Having this exchange, this interview about the war, and I like the emphasis on the war in a negative way, but still recognizing that even these characters that are sympathetic might have a very skewed perspective on what's going on. There's a lot going on with Sigurd that Simon will explain better than I can.
This is the first one. If you listen to them in order, this is the first one you would have heard that I would have been most of the all of the writing behind. All of the writing behind, I think. There's a fair amount of Simon headcanon in this one. Bill, the brownie, fills a really interesting role for me because there's this huge disconnect between what Fae society would have been like before the Resurgence and the Accordance War and after the Resurgence and the Accordance War. And all of the modern Changeling stuff, all the way through C20, just deals with that after point. While I think C20 went farther into, no, really, the She aren't the good guys here territory than the other ones did. So much of the internal game framing is around the She kind of being, at worst, benign with some bad actors mixed in. I wanted to write a character who had very clear memories of the time before the Accordance War, no memory of the Accordance War, and very clear memory of the time after the Accordance War. And with Changeling, there are two mechanisms for dealing with that. One, you can have somebody be in a banality coma, or two, you can have them just be dead for a while. I went with dead because the disjunction between lives seems like such a strong demarcation for these two experiences being wildly different, which they would be if you had any amount of remembrance of the past. On the flip side, there's Sigurd, who is formally of House Icene, but the point where he fell out with the She generally was during the Accordance War when he started to experience echoes of the human being he had displaced. And I have this whole like head canon for like what would happen if a She decided to actually do the changeling way right, but it took them, you know, a few years to realize they wanted to do that. What would you have to do? In my mind, Sigurd is one of those She who like realizes he's a part of this really toxic, corrosive power structure and can't stand it, but at the same time, he's still got the force of the dreaming behind him, pulling him back into that you deserve this, this is the way the world should be kind of mindset. I tried to write him as very sympathetic to the commoners. At the same time, it was challenging, and I may not have completely succeeded at making him also seem like he may not be succeeding in all cases.
Sigurd shows up in some of the other pieces, and so I think when you take his role in the episode as a whole, I think you did communicate that. He's imperfect to me. He very much strikes me as yeah, okay, the She don't like him anymore, but he still has kind of the force of the dreaming a little bit. He still has the knowledge and everything he gained while he was a noble magically in terms of arts and realms. He still carries some of that with him. It kind of shows the amount of knowledge he has later on, and we can talk about that in more detail when we get to the other segments with him. At least it reads to me, but I'm hyper cognizant of some of those dynamics and I think about them a lot, so maybe some of that is what I'm bringing to my read of the character.
I also wanted Sigurd and Bill to kind of be opposite but equal parts of each other, where Bill is at this point in the story quite young, but not a child. He's very clearly in the age range where he would be in college or just done with college. And Sigurd is rather a bit older than that, but they both have similar professions. They both have very similar motivations. It's just the place they came from is completely different. Even as a mortal, Sigurd's background was one of privilege and expectation. As a full mortal, before the she came in, Sigurd's body was a hippie. He was still doing the med school thing, but at the same time, his political motivations and leanings and sympathies were not with the ruling class. And I find that kind of tension in a single character very interesting, especially in somebody who has a dual nature like the she should.
The other thing I find fascinating about this particular piece, and I can't not read this into the piece, is Bill's status as a brownie. I first experienced Bill in your write up about the courtless Fae, which is a concept from Dark Ages Fae. Disclaimer to all the people that don't like the Dark Ages Fae tie in. We're about to talk about it a little bit. And bringing that idea that a Fae could be courtless, that a Fae could reject the names of the courts forward. And, I've even seen people who used to work on the Changeling line acknowledge the division between what the commoners had turned the courts into and their definition of Seelie and unseelie and what the she brought back with them. I mean, I kind of thought that was my headcanon for a while to make sense of the mess that seemed to be in the books, but I've seen other people confirm that the progressive traditionalist divide is more what the commoners turned the courts into, and then the she came back and brought more of the dawn, night, light, dark divide that was how they defined the courts. And all of that got into a big mixed soup. In the context of that, in the context of, Faye wanting the courts to mean very different things, giving a handful of Faye the ability to opt out the way Faye used to, if you do use the Dark Ages Faye tie in, I thought was really fascinating. And I know that's part of why you framed him as a brownie as opposed to a boggin.
Yeah, I wanted. Well, honestly, I just kind of hate the idea of boggins generally, even though I might be one. I really dislike the idea that you take all of these different homey myths and you throw it into boggin and you're good, and nobody takes issue with that. Anybody who has ever interacted with one of their aunts who is very, very proud of what it is they are, but they're not like those other people who are a slightly different shade of that same thing, would recognize the difficulty in cramming things together like that. And it also provides another point of mirror between Sigurd and Bill, where Sigurd abdicates his responsibility. Well, what the she would call his responsibility, what he would call his privilege, probably. And that reflects in Bill, where rather than having a conscious decision to reject the courts, he simply rejects the courts out of his nature because strong memories of lots of lives in the interregnum, and then was completely absent for the Accordance War. There's a very she like note in there where the past has much more meaning than the present does for Bill, even though he's not a she. And the next two exhibits are part of a pair I wrote is very strongly inspired by canon material. There's a bit in War and Concordia, may not be exactly a page, but it's pretty close to a page, talking about the treatment of commoners during the period in which High King David is missing, and how all the she are battening down the hatches, preparing for the last winter. I kind of latched onto the idea of the loyalty oaths, and the loyalty oath that Ybril and Jens are coerced into is only a hair harsher than the example one that was written in War and Concordia. And
Yeah.
then the place where it really breaks apart into headcanon territory is the coyote who gets them into the dreaming reflection of the internet. There was never a book written about any of this stuff, but I took the Svartalfar who their, I think it's their birthright, is the power to change recently crystallized changelings into Thalane. And I have this whole setting for the internet that isn't super germane, but there's a faction of Svartalfar in the internet who ran afoul of a bigger, badder dreaming spirit that kind of grabbed onto them and just twisted them a little bit and changed that birthright from changing changelings into Thalane into changing changelings into things that can interact with the dreaming side of the internet, which is sort of its own spirit realm thing in my mind.
Well, and this intersects a couple really fascinating places in the canon because the idea of the dreaming net exists in C20. It's only really acknowledged in She House write up. I want to say it's a Beaumain, and I think Beaumain is called out in this piece. They have an MMO that they're running, and it's this really weird intersection between their Sealy, but they're doing the super progressive thing, and especially for the she, because we're now on the she side of court definition. That gets weird. The thing that I find fascinating about this piece is it also intersects with War and Concordia, which is a book that, in doing research for these episodes, I realized was kind of retconned by C20. There is next to nothing in War and Concordia that's really acknowledged in C20. The Urban Renewal League does not show up. The Red Branch Knights are name dropped twice as existing, and that's it. All of the political complexity in War and Concordia, of the fractured thing they've become fighting for their unified identity because that's their dream, but now that dream is faltered, and there's all this rich subtext, and they're just a faction that exists in C20. And it really felt like C20 wanted to branch off before that whole political mess in War and Concordia and just get right to bringing David back. And so I love that this piece directly invokes War and Concordia and directly invokes new canon from C20 because I think the best that Changeling canon has to offer is actually in bringing both of those things to bear. There's some cool new stuff in C20, but I feel like a lot of it's more vibrant in the context of that last burst we got from the line before it was canceled.
Yeah, the last few books that came out of Changeling before the end, they're some of my favorite ones from the old line. The second part of this story, there's a bit of a time jump there. Hopefully that was clear. But it involves Ybril bringing gens to Dr. Sigurd at this point, them having found their way out of the dreaming net and back into the waking world somewhere other than Cold Fort, which is a canon location in War and Concordia. I didn't rate this part of the story, and it didn't seem super germane to it, but at some point, Jens has the opportunity to break her loyalty oath, which she does, and she's then struck down by the penalty clauses of the loyalty oath. That sets up Ybril trying to find a way to get her out of it. And I feel like that's kind of a necessary part of the story because it shows the real horror of having a legalistic magical force that's always there waiting for you to slip up. And it gives the opportunity for Sigurd to provide a little bit more information about the experience of the she that the she don't normally admit to. They don't admit in mixed company most of the time to the times when they're not on the top of the totem pole. I really loved the idea that it was kin that had that power.
I liked the first piece with Sigurd, but I definitely got into Sigurd a lot more when I was voicing this piece. The whole relationship with the Dauntain, the story of what he encountered in the dreaming, the sort of weird implication of, merging what the Dantean used to be and what the Dantean are that you did a little bit of. You both invoke ruin and wielding the dreaming in one hand and banality in the other, which there's still some implications there in the new Dantean, a little bit of that. I feel like this is really the piece where Sigurd brings some of his privilege to bear. He has all this remembrance and all this understanding of the nature of the dreaming and all of this understanding of the nature of these oaths. And really, the best he has to offer is, well, if you kill her and she reincarnates, she'll be released. Because if that didn't release her, none of us would function anymore. And that's just so. On one hand, I just love the brutal tragedy of that. But there was a certain amount of, yeah, well, of course he would offer that. Like, he's probably thought that in his previous life before he changed. He's probably had conversations with other Shi where they laugh about the fact that the commoners aren't strong enough to just kill themselves because it's the one way they could get out of their oath. And I can just see this being a softer version of some much more unsettling conversations in his past. And then the next exhibit is the Palace Menage a Trois. And, here we get kind of a next step from the Walkman. We have an MP3 player and earbuds. And it's funny, it's a thing that's almost the same as a Walkman, and yet it feels less tactile. And I kind of like that transition. I wrote this piece, but Simon wrote the framing piece, and it fits because of how removed King David is. This piece is the only one where we did not use any of our own characters. These are all canon characters. And really, I'm pretty sure everyone listening to this is going to recognize High King David, High Queen Fairlith, and King Maelg. They're pretty central. What I really wanted to try and capture in this, and this was a section that, Simon marked as, well, clearly we have to talk about this, but oh my god, what is going on in C20? Where is Caliburn? What's going on in the castle? With none of this, like, where is Mab? What's happening? And I read his notes, and I said, you know what, let me try and write this. Which was probably a moment of celebration for Simon, because I know he did not want to write this piece. And I got into it, and I looked at War in Concordia, and I looked at the huge political mess that was there, and I realized in reading C20, none of the other political players that are presented as having a huge sort of piece in the game make any moves. And in C20, it's presented that basically everyone that was vying for the throne was arguing, and then in walks High King David, and they all stop, and Fairlith throws herself at David, and they profess their love, and everyone doesn't do anything at that point. High King David takes the throne. He doesn't really rule. He becomes reclusive. No one does anything with that. No one makes any power plays. Caliburn doesn't even show up. What's going on? And I had to go, all right, well, what would make all of that make sense? And Simon had commented that clearly Fairlith and Maelg are the forces behind the crown. And I went back and I looked at Kingdom of Willows, and there's this interesting thing in Kingdom of Willows where Fairlith just loves David to death, and she's so honest, and she's so true. But she's Islanded. And I mean, that's just not how Islanded is written. King Maelg even says, oh no, she's Islanded. Her blood will speak to her. She'll come around. And I thought, what if she did, but she didn't? What if her Islanded nature came to play because of everything that happened, and she resented it, and she hated it, and she still loves her husband, and she's still pulling his strings, and what would make that happen? I also wanted to use this piece to kind of call out the new Bedlam dynamics, because in the old edition of the game, Bedlam was described as you have too much glamour and not enough willpower, not enough banality, and you fall off into the dreaming and you go insane. And there was an actual system around how much glamour and willpower do you have compared to how much banality and willpower do you have, and it was a weird system, and I'm kind of glad they got rid of it. But they also got rid of the "you're next to a balefire that makes you go into Bedlam faster" thing. And I went, this is such a huge story point. What's going on? I mean, that's a huge thing to strike. And it took me a long time. And then I realized they didn't strike it. What they did is now, as you use magic in its most uncontrolled forms, you become more and more Bedlam adjusted. Bedlam creeps in. And the only way to get rid of Bedlam is to go through Epiphany. Revelries only happen once a story, so you're not going to get very far with that, which means you have to be interacting with other humans. You have to either cultivate the human creative half of you a lot, or you have to muse, you have to ravage. In theory, you could Rhapsody and get rid of a Bedlam adjustment, but that would be a ginormous waste of glamour. So you have to have human contact. And I love that because that speaks to the need and the neuroses of seclusion, I think, much more elegantly than the old system, but they don't ever call it out in any flavor. And I really wanted to call that out in flavor in this piece. And so I have the bit about, oh, well, David was in an iron cage, which is canon. That's what happened to High King David. He stayed in an iron cage for ages, so he comes in and he's full of banality. And that's kind of how he's presented in C20, removed and empty, and like he's still a changeling, but only barely. Because now it's not sort of falling off either edge of the blade. It's, oh God, I can't get any more banality. I can't get any more banality. I can't be around humans because if they give me any more banality, I'm going to die. And so he clings to the balefire and he burns all that glamour from the balefire, getting rid of his banality. He still works magic now and then, and once the nightmare starts rolling, along comes Bedlam, because that's how the system works now. There's all this stuff going on in the canon about David's dream holding Concordia together, and the land being transformed by his fey will. I always kind of read it as that's why Caliburn picked him. But if he falls, it's not like anyone else can pull that off. That's kind of singular, especially in the current age of less magic. So I like this idea that Maelg is still trying to play things and get the advantage and somehow maybe take over, even though his last attempt failed. And I kind of imply here that it failed not just politically, but magically. He realized just what David was maintaining and that he didn't have the chops for it. And that Fairlith doesn't want all of Concordia to fall. And so she's playing the game because she has to. And her island nature has awakened and she resents it. And that's everything I was trying to capture here. It was a lot to sort of weave together. I missed a couple pieces of it. I didn't explain the Bedlam thing properly in the first draft, and Simon caught that. This is a weird one. I have no idea if I actually shoved all those ideas into this little bit of scripting.
While I was working on the production for that bit, I realized that from our conversation with the By Night Studios folks, I had been thinking of Mielgi as this very Trump-esque figure, and I realized as I was working on the production for this vignette that Mielgi isn't Trump. Mielgi is maybe Sessions, maybe Pence. He's probably a very skilled, very functional human being slash not human being. He's just not the person who can handle the spotlight. He had to maneuver behind the scenes, behind the throne, and I really like Victor's interpretation that even when his maneuvering resulted in the opportunity for him to step into the spotlight, he tried it and quickly realized he couldn't.
Speaking of By Night Studios, I also, we focused on the tabletop canon. I wanted to throw one call out to By Night Studios, which is why I did put the reference to Maelg working within the Shadow Court and using the situation and the kind of sort of Damocles he has hanging over Fairlith to force her into helping him play his Shadow Court politics. This is obviously not a version of the world where he's ascended to regent. It's not their canon. But I wanted to nod to that and the ways that maybe their canon could be used in the tabletop canon if you wanted to go that route.
And the next one we have The framing device for it is something that I think early millennials can feel. Later millennials might find a bit anachronistic, which I hope is functioning as intended, but it's meant to be a instant messaging conversation between several Fomorian aligned changelings, and Victor wrote this one, but I had a lot of fun being James.
Yeah, I love the heck out of writing this because being evil is fun. That's why I'm a storyteller. Yeah, they're such monsters. One of the things I wanted to accomplish with this one, I wanted to tackle the part of the canon that was introduced in C20 that I had the most trouble with. And I've talked about this on previous episodes. If you really want to hear my unfiltered thoughts on this, you can go listen to the Thalain Adhene Dark Glamour episode. And that's the Shadow Court. You know, and at the time that we brought this up last, I was kind of like, yeah, I don't really want to use the C20 Shadow Court. It's terrible. Well, I guess there's this one story over here that you maybe if you wanted to thread that needle. And I went, okay, no, I'm going to try and thread that needle. And the framing for the Shadow Court in C20 is that the Shadow Court has inspired Black Lives Matter and the Arab Spring and Occupy and all of these other social justice movements. Some of them, like Occupy, are not explicitly racial and were, in fact, pretty heavily white. I went to a couple Occupy events. Black Lives Matter and the Arab Spring are obviously very specifically racially defined and exist in that context. Then they also have the Thalain and Fomorian factions moving within and manipulating the Shadow Court, and so having those forces inspire those particular social movements, it gets into the messy naming, progressive, evil, what's really going on with the courts thing, but it gets into it in a way that made me very uncomfortable. But the story that I thought there was to be told there is the paid fake protester. And there's a lot documented on this where there have been a number of protests that have happened and the protesters are peaceful and then someone comes in and starts quote unquote protesting violently. And you know, I have no way to prove that it's happened in every case, but in a very large number of cases it's later found out that they're actually individuals that are opposed to the protest, that pose as protesters protesting violently to discredit the cause. And I'm comfortable with that framing for the Fomorians, for Fomorian agents and changelings, because that is a thing worth critiquing and inspecting. And through the lens of the way the Fae do combat with stories, there's a really insidious, creeping story to inspect there. And that's what I was trying to capture with their exchange. Simon and I went back and forth editing this one for a while because it's a hard concept to capture in dialogue. I think we got it, but this one had a couple versions. You know, there's James, this high powered boggin that just wants to seed fear and ravage profit out of that fear. And then this Balorian she that's much more subtle in playing the removed Balorian, you know, game and being an agent within the she because he's still she and they can't quite bring themselves to believe that the Balorians are all Thalain, evil, aligned, horrible things. And then Aghast. And I wanted to bring in Aghast because I wanted to invoke the Evanescence and one of the new Thalain that appeared. So that's what Penelope is, and I found the idea of her and the sort of fear she would be seeding really fascinating. I've actually since folded her into my current Changeling campaign, so not totally sure how that's going to play out.
And there was a little bit in here where the line between what is ravaging and what is reverie is a little bit blurry because there's that bit where where you call out that Penelope is a plant and she's inspiring violence or outrage or something, but all of those things were things that would have been under the purview of ravaging in second edition.
Yes, so I guess this gets into headcanon, and I do not run musing and ravaging the way they are written. I run musing as inspiring emotion. I run ravaging as ripping emotion out of a target. Full stop. Good emotions, bad emotions, neutral emotions, that's all musing. Whether it's your emotion or creativity. If you inspire a serial murderer, it's still musing. If you inspire a great artist, it's still musing. There's a story in the C20 anthology, and we talked about it a little bit several episodes ago, where there's a changeling who repeatedly ravaged her abusive father because then he was just numb and didn't have it in him to be abusive anymore. That's still ravaging. You're ripping the potential out of a person. You're going to leave them void and empty. Even if you're ripping out something horrible, that's the thing that's making them tick. Maybe them ticking is horrible, but it's what's making them tick. That's still ravaging. And the idea of the unseelie code of glamour is free being a reference for ravaging, I'm okay with that, especially because if you go back to the myths, the Seelie were fairies who gave, the unseelie were fairies who take. There's a story there. There's a whole dynamic there worth inspecting. But once you go all the way over to the Fomorians and you get out of that Seelie unseelie code, I think there's much more of a place for really a Thelaine isn't any more likely to muse or ravage than any other Kithane. It's just a matter of what they're musing and ravaging. If they ravage, they're probably ripping out love and loyalty and passion and joy, and then they'll turn around and muse what's left to turn you into their instrument. And that's really how I view them, and I wanted to embody that. I wanted Penelope to be inspiring all the things that would make people fear Jaden and fear the progressive things he was trying to do, because that's what the Shadow Court really wants to accomplish. People are afraid of change. People are afraid of justice. They're afraid of losing their place in the world. And if someone else wants a better place than they have, does that mean I have to give something up? There's a whole fear dynamic there to be inspected, to be taken advantage of. Having the Thelaine playing that game, I think, speaks to a lot of things that happen in the real world. And that's really what I wanted to invoke.
Kind of an aside, but this was one of the vignettes where I was working to try to convey information non-verbally. Each of the different characters in this has a different typing speed. And something about Penelope being a hunt and pecker really cracked me up. But I don't think anybody's going to notice it.
Oh, but it's fantastic. I liked recording these. I liked doing the initial cleanup edit on these, but listening once you brought them all together with sound effects was really that it drove a lot of the details home for me.
The other exhibit we have is a collection of case notes and official documents from what became Dr. Bill's psychiatric practice. And I really wanted to bring Bellerophon into our conversation about the the place of changelings in the modern world, because anybody who listened to the first episode may have noticed that I used the Enchanted and for one of the readings, and that is the book where Bellerophon is introduced. It's just such a visceral piece of horror for me. While all of the political drama around the She and the nature of the Concordian world and the dream and the dreaming and what the place all of these different changelings have in that is interesting, and the majority of the story for Changeling, the place of the autumn people is where the horror comes from for me. And I used Bill, the courtless brownie, to inspect this because of all of the changelings. I feel like the ones who would have the closest relationship to mortals would be the ones who don't have a whole lot of interest in the political drama and the court intrigue and all of that. And it was actually kind of hard for me to write some of it because as a gay man, like, it is still legal in a lot of states for parents to force their children to go through gay reparative therapy, even though most honest psychiatrists and psychologists admit that it doesn't work and that it's really just a form of torture. Writing DC in that role, being the kid who was forced through that sort of a thing and whose parents are still trying to make him do that. They just had the misfortune of picking the psychiatrist who plays a good game towards being one of those therapists but is actually not, is the only thing that ends up saving him.
Yeah, and these pieces were really interesting for me to work through. The first piece I ever wrote on Changeling, which we did use a piece of that for one of the flavor pieces in an early episode, kind of dealt with this dynamic, but not from within the psychiatric framework, because I had a friend in high school who was sent to basically not necessarily reparative therapy in a psychiatric standpoint, but in a camp that was designed to make you straight. And it would the stories he brought back from that camp were just really bizarre, and my friends and I and he all laughed through how absurd they were at the time, and it was a nervous coping mechanism. And the first time I wrote about Changeling, it was writing from that point of view. And it was after talking to a lot of people who didn't necessarily see Changeling as horror. And, that lived experience is a lot of what makes Changeling horror for me. And so seeing that, it did two things. One, it brought this part of the canon that is often ignored. I think that's probably about to change, actually, but it's often ignored. Really, a lot of the later books in the line focus so heavily on the Fairlith, David, Maelg, Red Branch Knights, Urban Renewal League, mess. And I love all that story, but it's a mess and it detracts from the human aspect of the game. Part of what I loved about what you did with this is it also kind of taps the C20 banality is relative thing. Bill is able to navigate the structures of being a psychiatrist. And it spoke to me because I ended up talking with my counselor a couple of years ago about Changeling. And, it was when I was starting to do writing on gaming and I was focusing on Changeling and, talking with her about the role Changeling put psychiatry in. She was very much not that therapist. And I think at the time that the game was originally written, the whole world of darkness was just really, really heavily built on this, oh, the modern is bad and science is bad and psychiatrists are out to get you. And they were aiming for kind of an edge lordy horror thing there. And there was some truth to it. But the whole world has tempered that a little bit and been like, okay, that core story, there's some truth there, but let's dig into how it's messy now. And I think this tapped that in really fascinating ways. It also, going back to, who Bill was talking with first, it's a nice parallel to Sigurd. They're both kind of doctors, which is interesting.
A couple of the other things I wanted to do here was to bring the Canaan a little bit more fully into the story. I didn't realize it until we'd already recorded it, but here is a really good example of what changeling code switching would look like because Bill doesn't really use insider lingo when he's trying to bring DC around. He uses the language that's available and would be comprehensible, except in a couple of cases where, you're dealing with having just passed into the near dreaming through a trod. How do you explain that to somebody? Well, you kind of have to use new words. But as part of his kind of detachment from Kithane's society, and as part of, his strong remembrance of his past lives, I really wanted him to think of the dreaming not as the dreaming, but as Manido Aki, because his previous self, Sarah, had stronger ties with the Ghislaine than she did with other Kithane. And I wanted that to be an echo into his modern life that although he hasn't maintained those connections, the weight of them is still there and it frames some of his perspective.
I really liked that. I I thought that tied a lot of things together for me very elegantly. I also kind of liked the transformation on the part of DC because we don't get to see that very often. The game tends to focus on, changelings and Canaan once they're integrated into changeling society and they're up against the bastions of banality. But, that story about crystallizing, well, every once in a while you'll have a chrysalis story. Oh, we sensed a chrysalis. Go find and protect that kid. It doesn't get emphasized as much. One of the things I like in the Binet Studios' new Changeling is for Seemings, they've made it about how long has it been since you crystallized? How ensconced and established are you in Changeling society? How much have you become a leader? How much have you brought your wisdom to bear? And instead of Childling, there's, I think it's Foundling, Fosterling. There's a little bit that gets lost there in terms of what the Seemings represented in canon historically, but I also kind of like what it recreates because it creates more of a space for that. Oh my god, I've just this I don't know what to do with what? And so I like trying to get into that headspace for this character.
The last thing I'll bring up about DC is I wanted him to be an example of different ways kenning could work because I don't know if everybody plays it this way, but in every game I've played and story told, everybody uses kenning as supernatural sight. Not every culture, not every spiritual practice weights the sense of sight the way that a lot of Western practices do. And although it's harder to deal with, I'd like the idea of Kinane especially not having like a complete set of changeling senses. So DC has psychometry. He's got the ability to sense chimerical quality through touch rather than through vision. It just seems much more interesting to me than the standard, oh, it glows a bit. It has an aura thing.
We are pleased that your visit to our halls was productive, Agent. There's nothing to be ashamed of, you know. Imbalance happens to the best of us. Back in my wilder days, I forgot how to drive an embarrassing number of times. It seems the house already has another assignment for you. Here are your orders and the background information on this case. The Dozen will bring you your effects and see you out. The mists are straining in San Francisco. Local social media chatter indicates possible Thimble Spring activity. Due to the Pacifica riots following High King David's disappearance and a coordinated assault from both the Hessian and Nunyahi, as well as the tech industry's creeping autumn influence, Queen Arian has lost control of much of the southern part of her queendom. Concordian loyalists presume to be present, but unreliable. You may be forced to recruit Ghislaine or prodigals in your search for the Thimble Spring. Rendezvous with your paired godfather Death at one of the last Concordian strongholds in the area, Club Bannock. You will find attached 3 dossiers describing the likeliest Thimble Spring candidates.
Oh, hello, madam. It's good to see you so well again. As promised, here are your travel garments repaired and cleaned. We took the liberty of reloading the ordnance in your parasol as well. If you'd like some refreshment before heading out, I've prepared some tea and treacle tarts. I read that they're your favorite. House Dannon takes care to find out everything about its agents. Come, come. You know how time is here. You've got plenty of it until you're out of time. Tell me everything about what's going on in the Waking.
This has been us sort of talking through the canon, talking through the points of the canon that we inspected in the last episode. Our hope was to give you kind of a different way to experience the history, the modern history of Changeling from beginning to end. We hope we've given you some ideas, that there are definitely some things here that you can take to your table. We might be bringing some of these ideas to our blog as well. But this was definitely experimental for us. So we'd really love to hear your feedback. Jump on our Facebook page, comment when you see this post go up. Let us know what you think. Are there any periods of canon you really would have liked to have seen us tackle and you'd like to see us maybe talk about more in the future that we didn't get to? What did you really thoroughly enjoy, and what would you like us to do differently if we do something like this in the future? I'd like to thank my co-host Simon Eichhornchen. This has been an especially fantastic project for me to work on. I've had a lot of fun, and we both hope you had a lot of fun listening to it. And we hope you'll join us again for our next conversation. This has been Walking Away from Arcadia.
The music from this episode was LSD by Mon Plaisir. Today's poorly explained banality trigger: losing all of your hotkeys in a software update.